On a bright spring day in June 1920, a box of chocolates arrived at the home of a 43-year-old lawyer in Breconshire, England. The box was unmarked, but the chocolates looked delicious, so the lawyer began eating them. He soon became violently ill, which prompted an investigation. Authorities went on to uncover a sinister, decade-long plot of infidelity, greed, and revenge. And this one has a twist at the end that you won't see coming. Herbert Rowse Armstrong was born in Plymouth, UK on May 13, 1869. His parents were not well off by any means, but they were honest, hard-working people, and they saved diligently their whole lives, which allowed Herbert to attend Cambridge University, where he graduated with a law degree in 1895. He went on to earn a master's in 1901, and quickly received a job offer from a law firm in Newton Abbot. Herbert worked there for a year, but quickly grew tired of small-town life. He was an ambitious guy and longed for a situation where he could make a big name for himself. Herbert eventually accepted a new position in the more bustling metropolis of Breconshire. Shortly after moving there, he married a woman named Catherine Mary Friend, affectionately known as Kitty. The two had met while they were still living in Newton Abbot. They moved into a scenic estate called Mayfield House, which actually still stands today. Sitting atop a steep hill, the impressive 5,000 square foot mansion was surrounded by beautiful gardens. Herbert loved gardening. It provided him a relaxing outlet away from the demands of his job. He had loved the field of law when he started work, but 3 years in now, the stress of his daily responsibilities were starting to take a toll on his health. As Herbert tended to the property's garden beds, his main concern was eliminating the many dandelions that littered his lawn. He hated the look of the bright yellow flowers almost as much as the floating seedlings that they left all over the property. He regularly would apply a mixture of arsenic and herbicide in order to kill the dandelions. Mayfield was a well-kept estate. Herbert handled all of the outdoor work himself and hired a couple of maids to help Kitty with the domestic work. Kitty and Herbert enjoyed several happy years early in their marriage, which resulted in 3 children. Herbert's work life began to stabilize too as he found his footing at the new firm. The owner, Mr. Walker was his name, treated him exceptionally well and had even paid for his relocation expenses to Breconshire, which was not a common benefit for companies to offer at that time. Mr. Walker immediately recognized Herbert's intelligence and his strong work ethic. He saw huge potential for him at the firm long term. He also took it upon himself to introduce Herbert to his many wealthy and influential friends around town. Pretty quickly, Herbert had built a network of some of the most powerful people in all of England. Despite being in excellent health, Mr. Walker suddenly died in the summer of 1906 from an unknown cause. We just don't know what it was. But per his will, Herbert took over full ownership of the firm and things started to really take off. He was exceptionally skilled at his job and pretty quickly he needed to hire a few junior attorneys just to keep up with the workload. He became known as the best and most trusted attorney in all of Breconshire. Unfortunately, Herbert's home life did not match the positivity of work. Kitty was an aggressive, domineering woman, and Herbert was a small man, easily intimidated physically. Kitty enforced strict rules on his life and degraded him in public in front of friends and family. She would frequently cut social outings short and make him return home early against his will. This behavior, which hadn't at all been present when the two were first married, angered Herbert and began a smoldering fire deep inside of him. But Herbert was a very kind and non-confrontational man, at least outwardly, so he never addressed these things with his wife, but they began to consume his mind. When World War I broke out in 1914, Herbert was actually overjoyed when he was conscripted to go fight the Germans because it would give him a break from his wife. He had actually briefly served in the British Reserves a few years prior in another conflict, and this experience, along with his education, allowed him to begin the war as a captain. He served briefly in France and displayed such bravery there that he was promoted to a major. Herbert returned to England in 1916 and served as a training officer, traveling around to different military bases around England to shape the new recruits. While on his travels, Herbert grew very lonely. he craved the gentle, sweet touch of an encouraging woman. He began to pursue a string of love affairs, usually with much younger women. He just wasn't getting what he needed from his wife back home. In fact, she'd become such a negative force in his life that he actively avoided going home even when he had time away from the military base when he could have returned. But eventually, his break from Kitty came to an end when he was discharged from the army in 1919 after the war. Herbert returned to his old civilian life and picked up right where he'd left off at the legal firm, but his horrific home life also continued. The time apart did nothing to change Kitty's character, and Herbert realized with a sickening feeling in his stomach that he was trapped in this situation for the rest of his days. In Herbert's absence, one other legal practice, coincidentally located right across the street from Herbert's office, started to gain notoriety in the town of Breconshire. The owner was talking about retirement, and Herbert actually saw an opportunity to join forces with this new firm. He approached one of the younger partners, Oswald Martin was his name, with a merger offer. Oswald rejected the offer, but the two firms were pretty friendly with each other, at least for the time being. As Herbert started to build a relationship with Oswald, he noticed a shift in his wife's behavior. Kitty's domineering personality seemingly disappeared, but it wasn't a good thing. All her joy and vigor for life seemed to leave her as well. She spent all her days locked in her room in Mayfield House, gazing out of the window wistfully. She abandoned all of her household duties, and Herbert began to fear for his wife's mental state. Shortly after this shift in behavior, things got even worse when Kitty became violently ill. She began vomiting for days at a time and also complained of fevers and partial paralysis in her hands and feet. Despite intervention from the best doctors in town, her condition only worsened. The one positive of all this, though, was the illness seemed to mark a decided change in Herbert and Kitty's marriage. Herbert felt a pitiful softness for his wife that he hadn't ever experienced before. As she lay in bed, helpless to change her situation, her husband cared for her and prayed for good health to return. Despite Kitty's illness, for the first time in several years, the marriage began to resemble a real healthy relationship. But despite Herbert's best efforts, Kitty's condition only worsened. When she became delirious due to fever, doctors moved her to an asylum where they could better care for her. As Herbert waited for his wife to return, he would stare off into space and imagine the happy life that the two could live once Kitty recovered and came back home. Over the next 6 months, she gradually healed and was allowed to return to home in early 1921. Almost immediately upon this return, Kitty took a sharp turn for the worse. Herbert tried his very best, but he couldn't revive his wife, and she sadly died on February 22nd, exactly 1 month after leaving the asylum. The official cause of death was listed as gastritis, stomach inflammation, and heart disease. In a feverish insanity near the end, with Herbert stroking her hair and dampening her forehead with a cool rag, Kitty cried out, "I'm not going to die, am I? I have so much to live for. My husband and my children." Just 4 people attended Kitty's gloomy funeral the next week at St. David's Church. Herbert was crushed. A year ago, he probably wouldn't have had this reaction, but Kitty's illness had brought them much closer together. Everything that Kitty owned was left to Herbert, which reflected a very recent will that Herbert had helped Kitty write shortly before she left for the asylum. Her original will actually left everything to the children and not Herbert. And so, Herbert trudged on with life. He hired some additional domestic help at Mayfield to care for the children as he continued to work long hours at the legal firm. He continued to succeed and grow the practice too, but he felt an emptiness inside that he just hadn't felt before. Without a life partner to share everything with, what was the point of all this success? In an effort to fill this void, Herbert would host frequent dinner parties with his wealthy network. He faked smiles and continued to put on the social charm he'd become known for, but it all just felt so damn meaningless. As Herbert fought this dark loneliness, work started to become more stressful. Shortly before Kitty's death, he'd become locked in a property transfer dispute with Oswald's firm, and tensions were bubbling to the surface. The two firms were representing opposite sides in the sale of a large estate. Herbert got the raw end of the deal and was legally obligated to pay Oswald a sum of £500, which in today's dollars would be about £27,000. Herbert made a large income and was considered very wealthy by most of the population in Breconshire, but he carried a lot of of expenses too. There was the rent and upkeep of his office, the payroll for 2 junior attorneys, along with his mortgage and property expenses at Mayfield. He actually lived a lot closer to the edge than a lot of people would have guessed by how he presented himself. That had worked okay thus far because he hadn't had any large unexpected expenses, but when Oswald pushed him for the money, Herbert simply couldn't pay him because he didn't have it. Now, Herbert didn't let on to this, of course. His pride wouldn't allow for that. He claimed that the payment was illegitimate and fought it in court, but deep down, he knew he was wrong, and fighting it in court was only buying him time. Eventually, Herbert would be on the hook for the full amount, and this started to take a toll on his health. His mind ran wild at night as he envisioned scenarios of losing Mayfield and entering debtor's prison to pay off the amount. Fear took over, and Herbert frantically searched for a way out. A few weeks later, Oswald Martin received a box of expensive chocolates at his doorstep. The package was unmarked, but Oswald opened the box and the chocolates looked delicious. He happened to be hosting a dinner party later that night, and he figured that the chocolates would make a nice addition to the dessert spread. His guests eagerly enjoyed the treats later that night, but many of them became violently unwell the next day. Oswald called the local doctor the next morning to care for his sick guests who'd had to spend the night at his house, and after some investigation, the doctor determined that the chocolates were the common factor with the illness. The chocolates were analyzed in a lab, and it was discovered that they each had a small hole in the bottom, and mixed in with the filling was a large amount of arsenic. Luckily, no one at the party had eaten more than 2 of the treats, but the doctor determined that had anyone done so, they would have died. With no way to determine who had sent the chocolates, the investigation was abandoned and life went on as usual. Over the next couple months, Oswald started to notice a change in Herbert's behavior. Herbert had been avoiding him in public and exuding a cold, unfeeling energy as the estate dispute raged on, but this started to shift. Herbert started greeting him in the mornings, he held the door for him and complimented him on his fine business suits. The two even grabbed a beer one evening after work at a pub down the street from their offices. Herbert assured Oswald that he would pay the £500, he just needed a few more weeks to get the money together. Before they parted ways for the night, Herbert invited Oswald for a lunch later that week. Oswald arrived at Mayfield House a few days later. The maids prepared a delicious-looking spread of sandwiches and sweets. Herbert excused himself from the dining room table midway through the meal and said he'd be right back. He returned with a golden brown scone dripping with melted butter and whipped cream, and he placed it on Oswald's plate, who happily indulged. He even enjoyed a second one right after that. After lunch, the two walked around Herbert's beautiful property. They discussed business until about 5 p.m. when Oswald returned home to his wife for dinner. Later that evening, Oswald started complaining of a pain in his stomach, and he very quickly became violently ill. He broke out in a high fever and was vomiting, and the symptoms only worsened over the next couple of days. Oswald's wife called Dr. Hanks, who coincidentally had also treated Kitty and the sick guests at Oswald's dinner party. Dr. Hanks suspected that the illness might have something to do with the lunch he'd eaten at Herbert's house. He collected a urine sample from Oswald and sent it off to London for analysis. The results confirmed his suspicions. Oswald's urine contained a dangerous amount of arsenic. Dr. Hanks reported this to the local police because he was legally obligated to do so, and Scotland Yard was brought into Breconshire in order to investigate. The detectives very quickly determined that Herbert was the common link between the chocolate incident and Oswald's illness. Even more incriminating was the fact that Herbert regularly ordered arsenic to control his dandelion problem at Mayfield. Herbert was an upstanding, well-respected member of the community, and Scotland Yard didn't want to ruin his reputation prematurely, so they conducted a secret investigation at night. They interviewed Herbert and gathered medical notes from Dr. Hanks. After a few weeks, they'd gathered enough information, and Herbert Armstrong was arrested. After the arrest, the detectives were granted a warrant for a post-mortem analysis of Kitty's body, and it too was found to contain arsenic. Despite this, Herbert insisted that he was innocent. During his trial in April 1922, he was calm and confident because he knew courtrooms so well. In his defense, he claimed that Kitty was depressed and had taken her own life, but the prosecution responded that if that were true, her final words didn't really make much sense, right? About having so much to live for and her husband and her children. That doesn't really sound like a suicidal person. After reviewing all the evidence, the jury found Herbert guilty for the murder of his wife and attempted murder of Oswald Martin. He was sentenced to death. On the 31st of May, 1922, armed guards walked him from his cell in Gloucester Prison to the gallows. As he stood there with a noose around his neck awaiting death, his final words were, "Kitty, I'm coming for you." Shortly after Herbert's death, Oswald Martin purchased his firm and incorporated it into his own business. Without competition now, Oswald's firm became dominant in Breconshire. He enjoyed a highly successful career before retiring in 1951. After that, he spent the majority of his life birdwatching and writing mystery novels, which was always a passion of his. Oswald Martin died in 1962 at the age of 85. Shortly after his death, one of his junior associates named Henry Taylor was organizing his belongings and figuring out what to keep. He found something buried under a pile of legal paperwork in the bottom right-hand drawer of a desk. It was a manuscript for Oswald's final novel, not yet published. Out of curiosity, Hank began flipping through the dusty pages. He sat down on Oswald's leather couch and quickly found himself engrossed in the story. Hank, who was familiar with the story of Herbert and the arsenic, felt an eerie unease the further he read through the manuscript. The novel, titled Dandelions, detailed the story of two business rivals. The two start as good friends, but a deep-seated jealousy comes between them. As the sentiment grows, one of the men begins plotting to bring the other down. Through masterful knowledge of poison, the man murders his enemy's wife, sets a series of traps over several years that result in the arrest, trial, and execution of his rival. I suppose the novel could have been coincidence, but the details are eerily similar to the story of Herbert Armstrong. So, was Herbert actually guilty of murder, or was he framed by his business rival, Oswald Martin? We may never know. Thanks for listening.